Ah, I'm so tired. In the middle of the night, I walk home with an exhausted body. I stayed at work very late because of job responsibilities. Feeling sorry for getting home late to my husband Keith and my father-in-law George, I start jogging toward the house. Suddenly, I stop in front of my house. The garage door is open. Before I can even think why, the car parked in the garage suddenly speeds out. Eek! I let out a small scream and shrink back as the car comes to a sudden stop right in front of me. Behind the wheel was my father-in-law, George. As soon as he noticed me, he opened the passenger door from the inside.
Haley, get in the car.
What? Wait a second. What's going on at this hour?
Don't make a fuss. I'll explain later. Just get in the car now.
Under the intense pressure, I quickly opened the passenger door and got into the car. Eek! Before I can lock my seatbelt, George speeds off, and I let out another small scream. As the car takes off, I hear a shout from behind. Turning around, I see Keith yelling incoherently. He's chasing after our rapidly accelerating car. What is this? What's happening? Keith is chasing us with a furious look on his face, while George grips the wheel with a stern expression. Stuck between the two of them, I can only grimace in fear. My name is Haley Smith. I work as a tutor at a tutoring center near the station and live with my husband Keith. We both work at the same place, but Keith is a full-time employee while I work part-time. I handle most of the housework, though Keith helps out if I ask. If I ask, that is. Keith has a handsome face. When we're just going about our day, he often looks at me with droopy eyes and a slight smile. When he watches me wash the dishes, smiling a little, I can't help but laugh. What? What are you looking at?
Your hairstyle. The way you tie it back. I think it's really beautiful.
I almost dropped a dish I'm rinsing off. Keith is always like this. He compliments me on things I don't even think about, little details I overlook. Even though it's obviously just flattery, it still makes me happy. He's kind. Maybe too kind. Since we work together at the same tutoring center, Keith is technically my boss. If my students' grades improve, it reflects positively on my evaluation. Otherwise, I'm expected to seek appropriate measures. Besides teaching, there are reports to write and lesson plans to prepare. Even when I make mistakes, Keith never gets angry. He always helps and guides me patiently. To others, he might seem like the perfect, kind husband. I think so too. But there's a strange discomfort in my heart that I can't ignore. Is it awful of me not to fully trust such a kind husband? Keith and I met at our current workplace. I don't remember feeling anything special when we first met. We probably got married because we had a lot in common. That was a long time ago. My parents died in a car accident. It happened when I was in 5th grade, on our way to a spa resort hotel. I remember looking out the car window at the unfamiliar countryside scenery.
Watch out! Damn it!
Suddenly, my father let out a painful scream, and my mother grabbed me tightly. A car, its driver having an epileptic seizure, collided with ours, making the news. My father and mother died. I only had minor fractures in my arms and legs. Relatives and friends who visited me all said I was miraculously lucky or fortunate to be safe. Staring at my bandaged limbs, I asked myself, is this a miracle? Is this being fortunate? My mother's relative, with tears in her eyes, said,
Haley, your mom died holding you protectively. You need to live for her sake.
This is a lie. It's all a dream. None of this is real.
Yes, I know. You're confused now, but it's going to be all right. Everything will be okay.
I pressed my bandaged hand against the hospital bed rail, feeling the pain to confirm it was real. It wasn't fake. It was genuine pain. I couldn't stop crying. The fact that my parents were gone, and the fact that I was still alive made me sad. Despite this, my kind relatives supported me as I grew up. I think I received a lot of love. I have to become a proper adult. I always resolved in my heart so. After that, I threw myself into my work. I met Keith at the same workplace, and gradually, his dedication to work caught my eye. His way of interacting with students, his serious and sincere attitude. He was kind to everyone and had good looks, so I thought he was out of my league and not a potential romantic partner. Keith asked me out on our first date. Then the second and the third dates were also initiated by him. I was the one who asked to start dating. By the end of our third date, I couldn't hold back my feelings for him. When I asked him to date me, Keith talked about his past with a slightly clouded expression.
I lost my mom and live with my elderly father. Also, I recently got divorced.
I see.
I'm trying to bury myself in work to forget about the divorce. Knowing I'm divorced might make you reconsider dating me.
I don't mind. Because I admire your dedication to your work.
Keith looked a little surprised, but then smiled gently. The longer we dated, the more we were drawn to each other. As I was approaching 40, Keith proposed to me. In a dimly lit restaurant on a high floor overlooking the beautiful night sea. It was like a setting made for a proposal, and he said seriously,
Will you marry me?
At that moment, I felt like I was the protagonist in a drama. Losing my parents, feeling hopeless, and thinking this world was fake. It finally felt like the scenery in front of my eyes became real. Keith told me about his family, which he hadn't talked much about before. His mother had already passed away. He lived with his elderly father, George. After we got married, he suggested that we live with George since he was worried about him, and I agreed without hesitation. Both George and Keith were kind, and I was living a satisfying life. We decided not to have children. Having experienced the pain and sadness of losing parents, Keith and I were both afraid of becoming parents ourselves. I've come to terms with this way of living. A few years after we got married, Keith was very kind. He accepted almost all of my suggestions and forgave my household mistakes with a smile. He would smile, turn his back on me, and looked somewhere far away. His kindness, which I had considered a virtue, gradually changed within me. I began to feel that his behavior was no different from indifference. Moreover, Keith was not a person who talked much about himself. Being a tutor is fulfilling but demanding. His return times were irregular, and he often spent weekends alone in his study. He'd suddenly invite me shopping or on a date, worry about George's condition, and his actions had no pattern. I once heard somewhere that people who cheat have plenty of time. I don't remember where I heard it, but Keith's ever-composed demeanor always made me tilt my head in confusion. Keith is naturally handsome, and I knew he was popular. But cheating was unforgivable. Wanting to trust him, I decided to hire a private investigator. They said the investigation would take a week. The investigation was surprisingly expensive, but if it proved Keith's innocence, I could fully accept that he was truly kind. When I returned home from the investigator's office, I found George sitting in a chair, clutching his chest. "George." I rushed over, rubbed his back, and handed him his medicine and some water. George had a heart condition and was prescribed several medications. Due to his age, he also took medications for managing blood pressure and cholesterol. I wasn't told the details, but it seemed more like the medications were for controlling the disease's progression rather than curing it.
Thank you. I should feel better soon.
George generally lived a life similar to a healthy person, but sudden attacks were troublesome. They included chest pains, irregular breathing, muscle spasms, and more. Usually, resting in bed would calm them, but in severe cases, they could become disastrous. Recently, George's health had worsened. I stayed close to him and watched his condition. I wanted to consult with Keith, but even when I contacted him late at night, his only response was always, "I'm busy, sorry." Since we worked at the same place, I thought I knew how busy Keith was. Even though he was the one who suggested taking care of George, it was a bit cruel of him. I pout as I organized George's numerous medications into a case. Something feels off. A week later, I found myself in the cramped office of the detective agency. Sitting on a worn-out sofa, I listened to the investigator's report. The conclusion was that Keith was guilty. They told me he was having an affair with a woman named Teresa Wright. Teresa Wright. I've never heard that name before. Staring at the unknown woman's name and the candid photo of her profile, I felt my mood darken. Divorce, huh? I muttered as if it were someone else's problem. Losing my parents and getting used to loneliness, the fleeting happiness I grasped felt like a joke. I laughed softly. At home, I put the documents from the detective agency in an unused drawer of the dresser. I set the kettle on the stove, preparing my favorite herbal tea. As I poured hot water into the glass pot, the sweet, honey-like aroma of linden filled the room.
What a nice smell, Haley.
George emerged from the room, slightly holding his leg, and smiled. I immediately supported him and helped him to the sofa in the living room. When I handed him the TV remote, he quietly shook his head. So I made 2 cups of freshly brewed herbal tea and knelt on the floor.
It's delicious. I feel like I'll sleep well.
How are you feeling, George?
There are good days and bad days. But what about you, Haley? Are you not exhausted from taking care of me? Well, it's difficult to say in front of me.
George added with a laugh. His smile was very similar to Keith's when I first met him. Maybe that's why. Just like I would with Keith, I found myself opening up to George. I told him about hiring a detective to investigate Keith, about my feelings of betrayal, that I planned to confront Keith with the facts and consider divorce depending on his reaction, and that I had the papers ready. When I noticed George listening intently, I immediately regretted it. This was a problem between my husband and me, and burdening George, who was suffering from health issues, was wrong.
Thank you for telling me.
I tilted my head, not understanding the meaning behind his thanks. Feeling suddenly awkward, I took my tea and went to the kitchen. When I glanced back, George was staring quietly into space with a troubled expression. For a while, I hesitated to confront Keith about the affair. A divorce would disrupt our current life. I was afraid of the sudden change in life, just like the one caused by the car accident. I know from experience that I hate change. I'm convinced that having today be the same as yesterday and tomorrow be the same as today is happiness. Even if that means living a life connected by fake love. One day, due to taking care of George, I hadn't been able to fully attend to my work, and a problem arose with one of the students at the tutoring center I oversee. A parent complained that their child's grades had dropped with the usual study methods, and I had to come up with a clear plan to address it. Long overtime hours were expected. I asked Keith to leave work early and take care of George. Late at night, exhausted, I walked home. It took a long time, but I thought I had finally created a new study schedule. Feeling sorry for coming home late, I jogged towards the house. I stopped in front of the house. The garage door was open. Before I could wonder why, the car in the garage suddenly sped out. Eek! I let out a small scream and shrank back as the car screeched to a halt right in front of me.
Haley, get in the car.
What? Wait a minute. What's going on at this hour?
Don't make a fuss. I'll explain later. Just get in now.
Pressed by the urgency, I quickly opened the passenger door and got in the car. Eek! Before I could lock my seatbelt, the car sped off, and I let out another small scream. As the car took off, I heard a shout from behind. Turning around, I saw Keith yelling incoherently. He seemed to be chasing the speeding car, desperately trying to catch up with us until we turned a corner and he disappeared from view. At that volume, his voice must have echoed throughout the neighborhood. I sank deeply into the seat and sighed. It was the first time I'd seen Keith, always so calm and composed, so frantic. George, in the driver's seat, said nothing. It was clearly something serious. I didn't know what had happened, but I decided to wait for George to talk. For a while, we just drove along the road. It didn't seem like we had a destination, just driving aimlessly, until finally we stopped at a corner store with a large parking lot. George rested his forehead on the steering wheel and sighed deeply. "George, what happened?" Keith seemed really angry.
Sorry for the confusion. Where should I start?
George tapped his forehead against the steering wheel several times, organizing his thoughts. "I'll get us some drinks." I took the hint and bought some drinks from the corner store, handing one to George.
Thank you, Haley. This is going to be a long story. Will you listen?
With that preface, my father-in-law began his tale.
Yes, let's see. I should start by talking about my wife, Keith's mother, Angela.
I was surprised to learn that the late mother-in-law was involved in this commotion, and I tilted my head. Keith's mother, Angela, was apparently very prone to falling in love. When she was young, she reportedly dated multiple men at the same time.
You'd think I should have divorced someone like that, wouldn't you, Haley? But we had a young Keith at the time. I couldn't bring myself to make that decision.
I could understand a little why I couldn't immediately demand a divorce after discovering Keith's affair. It was the fear of losing family. Marriage isn't just a bond with your partner. I might lose the friends of George who had been so kind to me, and George himself. Thinking about that, I couldn't move forward.
Angela wasn't an irresponsible woman, though. That might have been her only virtue.
George explained that Angela devoted time to all the men she was seeing, facing them sincerely. She didn't dump household chores or childcare on George. Together, they fulfilled their responsibilities as parents and spouses, and she used her free time, which other women might spend on hobbies, to be with other men. She also never revealed this fact to Keith, considering his development. George looked at the brightly lit corner store with a slight smile.
Angela used to say it was an honest and upright multiple relationship. It was almost a catchphrase of hers.
George accepted Angela's lifestyle. He had no choice. It wasn't pleasant, but he realized that pretending not to see anything had almost no impact. But the family time came to a very quick end. Angela was diagnosed with a brain tumor at a young age and was told she didn't have long to live. Even then, she remained nonchalant.
Before she got seriously ill, she told each of her lovers about her condition and said goodbye. And in the end,
George took his hands off the steering wheel and looked at his palms. In the end, she passed away in the hospital, holding George's hand.
but I couldn't just be depressed. For Angela's sake, I worked hard to raise Keith properly.
However, bad signs started to show when Keith was in high school. Keith had grown into a womanizer. In the worst possible way, he had inherited Angela's tendency to fall in love quickly. He would charm women with his gentlemanly behavior and discard them irresponsibly when he got bored. George tried his best to have sincere conversations with Keith to stop this behavior. But Keith's bad habit never changed, and he ended up getting married. To me.
At first, I was against the marriage. It was obvious, wasn't it? I could see that Haley would end up unhappy. But Keith insisted.
As a condition of marriage, Keith proposed that we live together. It was a very appealing offer for George, who was physically disabled. But most of George's care was left to me. On the surface, Keith was kind, but behind the scenes, he was constantly playing around. Despite being busy with work, he still found time to have affairs. It was almost like a sickness.
I'd quit fooling around and prioritize married life.
At first, Keith apparently said so. George thought he'd wait and see for a while, but in reality, Keith was secretly having a great time. People's true nature doesn't change that easily.
Haley, you shared the detective's findings with me, didn't you? I appreciated that. I thought it was time to give him a real talking to.
That's kind of a strange thing to say.
What? Oh yes. Keith is twisted. I need to face my son properly.
I looked down a bit. It wasn't just Keith who seemed strange. Angela and even George seemed odd to me. Angela proudly having affairs. George, who allowed it with a peculiar kind of love. Honest and upright, multiple relationships. I felt a bit sorry for George, who spoke about it somewhat proudly. By the way, why did you suddenly take me outside? Keith seemed really angry.
When you came home, Keith was happily talking to his mistress on the phone. I thought it would be too much for you to witness that.
George, angry, had grabbed Keith's phone and smashed it on the floor. That's why Keith was chasing us. But wait, I already knew from the investigation that Keith was cheating. I don't really care about him talking to another woman on the phone now.
Are you feeling a bit calmer now?
Yes, I am. I see. Maybe George was angry for my sake, but also for himself. Anger towards the late Angela. He might be directing his unresolved anger at Keith. And he probably doesn't even realize it. Being betrayed by someone, justifying it, and now having no one left to hate. The engine started, and the car began to move. When we got home, we'd confront Keith about his affair. George and I agreed. We parked the car in the garage. Keith, silently drinking whiskey in the living room, glared at George and me with resentment. Without a word, I placed the detective's report on the table. A slightly drunk Keith rubbed his eyes and looked over the documents.
Oh, this. Well, it's a former student. It's not an affair or anything.
That's a lame excuse. There are photos and investigation results right there.
It's true. She's been struggling with work, and she said she wanted a quiet place to talk, just the two of us.
Keith made a feeble excuse. For once, he looked genuinely flustered, without his usual composure. I had loved Keith, who worked so hard and treated me with the kindest smile. Looking at him now, it was like watching his facade crumble away. My feelings for Keith rapidly cooled, and his desperate excuses, no matter how valid or not, began to mean nothing to me.
Enough, Keith. Pay Haley the alimony and agree to the divorce.
This is a matter between husband and wife. Stay out of it, Dad.
I have every right to interfere. I'm your father.
Keith was taken aback, then turned his gaze to me and quietly laughed. He must have realized from my cold eyes that I no longer had any love for him. To be honest, I didn't have a strong desire for a divorce. The procedures for a divorce are tedious, with a lot of paperwork and hassles. But if I didn't take a step forward now, I'd remain an unhappy woman forever, living a life pretending not to know about my husband's affair. George lived that way, so I don't completely reject it, but it still feels wrong. I can't claim to know what the ideal marriage looks like, but a relationship where one person feels sad or heartbroken doesn't seem right to me. Keith, let's get a divorce, right now.
Wait, Haley. I get it. I'll change my ways. I won't cheat anymore. I'll only look at you.
I'm not going to look at you anymore. With those final words, Keith fell silent, and the night quietly passed. A year later, Keith surprisingly agreed to the divorce rather easily. He remained as carefree as ever, even sending me casual texts after the divorce, asking how I was, or suggesting we go on a date. I can't tell if he's joking or serious, but I completely ignore him. Today is a beautifully sunny day. The rain is over, and the sky is clear. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, wearing a white dress that might be too youthful for my age. I'm still young. I'm still beautiful. The words Keith often told me might have been fake in hindsight, but my feelings now are undeniably real. My phone buzzed in my bag. When I held it to my ear, I heard a familiar voice.
Haley, it's been a while.
It was George, who unsolicitedly told me about Keith's current situation. Since the divorce, Keith had suddenly become more subdued and had refrained from dating women. He hasn't found a new partner yet and has been diligently taking care of George and participating in matchmaking events.
Everything is moving in a positive direction. Thank you for listening, Haley.
That's my word, thank you. I'm sorry, but I have to go now. Someone is waiting for me. I hung up the phone and looked at myself in the mirror. Since working at the same place as my ex-husband wasn't an option, I found a new job at another tutoring center. I needed a full-time position to support myself, and this whole ordeal made me rethink many things. Maybe I was afraid of love. The fear of suddenly losing someone important. I lost my parents in an accident, and from that day on, my entire life changed. Maybe it's the same with love. Even if you love someone, you will eventually part ways. Even if it's not your fault, you might suddenly be told goodbye. Perhaps during a date, when they say they're going to the bathroom, they could be caught in an unfortunate accident. No matter how long you're together, people always part with their loved ones. No one lives forever. Knowing that pain, suffering, and sadness from a young age, I might have been somewhat cold toward love. I was scared of genuinely falling in love. Maybe Keith sensed those feelings in me. I had no intention of condoning Keith's affair. But if I had truly loved him from the bottom of my heart, if I was desperately trying to catch his attention by eagerly responding to his always gentle yet somewhat indifferent attitude, That's just wishful thinking. I looked at myself in the mirror. Have I changed since a year ago? I lightly touched up my makeup and left the restroom. There were a few families and couples waiting in front of the elevator in the crowded shopping mall. In the waiting area, a tall man smiled at me, and it seemed to light up the space around him. I smiled back at him. Casually, I held his hand. He looked a bit surprised, but he didn't let go. That made me smile even more. Now, I am taking a step forward to find true happiness.